I'm delighted to introduce our speaker this evening. And just before I do that, I should remind you that we are recording this evening. So please keep your cameras and microphones off during the presentation to lessen any possible interference. And the chat function will be open throughout the presentation, and we hope for lots of lovely questions at the end. So Dr. Jill Clarke is a writer, curator, and former academic. Her recent publication with Steve Marshall, Parallel Lives, 8 Women Artists, accompanies the exhibition of the same name at St Barbe Museum and Art Gallery in Lymington in Hampshire. And as Jill reminds me, it's running until the 13th of January. So you have lots of time to see it, and I can highly recommend it, having seen it last Friday. So Jill is going to speak to us tonight about the exhibition and her book with Steve Marshall, which is a fantastic evocation of all those artists and a really good accompanying catalogue, but also a standalone text. So enough from me, and over to you, Jill.
Thank you. Thank you. Thank you very much, Sarah. And I'm delighted to be able to talk to people tonight about the exhibition at Lymington Down in Hampshire, and to share really some snapshots with you of the 8 women artists who are featured in the exhibition. And it's very much looking at their careers, and all of them were born within 20 years of each other, and their lives span the 20th century. And there's Enid Marks, who I'll start with in a minute, Gertrude Hermes, Evelyn Dunbar, Ethel Cahoon, Wilhelmina Barnes-Graham, Prunella Clough, Barbara Jones, Monica Paul. If I've missed anyone out, you'll see them as we go anyway. But you'll see that their work covers a range of media, from sculpture, printmaking, wood engraving, textiles. It's all there, but stylistically diverse in many ways. But you'll see too, I hope, how they drew on different movements, sometimes selectively, whether it was surrealism, neo-romanticism. But I think in many ways what binds them together is their independent outlook and their singular sense of purpose, if you like. And they're all original creative forces, and each leaving a significant body of work. So if I start first of all with Enid Marks, who you can see her working in her studio in 1948, and over 7 decades she produced a remarkably diverse body of work, from textiles to wood engraving, book illustrations, and writing children's books. But she felt that her career just happened. Born in London, she attended the Royal College of Art, and I want to show you an example, first of all, of a wood engraving by her done in 1938. And in fact, it was interesting, her experience of wood engraving at the Royal College of Art, because the tutor, Professor Frank Short, the professor of engraving, didn't think that she knew well enough to actually attend his classes. So she was taught the rudiments of wood engraving by fellow student Eric Revilliers, who after the classes would pass on what he'd learned. And she was fortunate, though, that William Rothenstein, the principal at the time, had employed practicing artists, including Paul Nash. And she said of Paul Nash that all their work carried something of Paul Nash. And I think you get a flavour of that in this wood engraving. And interestingly, that despite Professor Short's sort of, shall we say, reservations about her wood engraving, she actually taught wood engraving at the Ruskin School of Art and elsewhere. So moving on to 1941, and these are only some of the works that are actually on show in the gallery. And Sarah mentioned the book, and all of the works that I'm showing you tonight, plus the others, are in the in the book. So this was her first children's book, and she wrote this in 1941 when she and her longtime life companion, the historian Margaret Lambert, were living in London. They'd moved out of Oxford, rather like the Slade that had moved out from London to Oxford. And she wrote this, and she produced all the text and the images, but it was a sellout. Young children, it was snapped up, and the first edition of 5,000 swiftly sold out. And it was published in the same year that actually they returned to London in 1941. And that year was significant too, because she was made a royal designer for industry for her excellence as a pattern maker. And she was the first such RDI to be accorded that accolade. And she felt, and also she was the first woman engraver too to be made an RDI. And she saw this as a sign of her acceptance. But before that, I think she'd felt very much that she was considered as a woman, just as an amateur. So moving on to, this is an example of some of the work that she did for London Underground. This was done in 1945, but she had done work for them previously in the late 30s. And you can see on the left-hand side the watercolor sketch that she did, this bold abstract pattern. And it needed to be, the brief, she welcomed the brief because it was quite strict, but it needed to be something that looked good in all lights, and also the wear and tear that it was to be subject to would not be readily noticeable. And some of you may well be familiar with some of her seat designs that were the patterns that were used on London Transport on both buses and trains. So she also did work for the London Transport for posters. And this is a good example here of her working with, this is London Transport Museum here, that she did this one for the zoo at Regent's Park. And I think you get that sense just by looking at it, from the animals there going in 2 by 2. So she also, this was one of a pair, and she did do a number of posters, and it was certainly eye-catching. The next work that I want to show you of hers is a lino cut. So again, you can see the diversity of her work and her versatility as well. This is an example of a lino cut that she did, and these are her Wally dogs. So, and Wally is it comes from a Gallic word for meaning made of China. And Evelyn Marks had a great love of, an avid knowledge of popular art and traditional art. And some of her pieces would appear in her work, as is here. And in fact, she had a huge collection of folk art, which is now in the collection at Compton Verney. So that gives you just a flavour of Enid Marks. But the next artist I want to move on to is Gertrude Hermes. And here you can see Gertrude Hermes at work in her studio. And this is in 1937. And she excelled as both a sculptor and a wood engraver. And she felt that there was a great affinity between the two. She was actually made a Royal Academician in 1971 and the first woman wood engraver to be so. So this is an example of one of her wood engravings done in 1938. And as well as having, I should say, work from national collections, we've also been very lucky to have work from private collections, which is, I think, a real bonus for us to have in that, and for visitors too. So she was something of a pioneering wood engraver. And this is Thornapple, and it was one of 20 wood engravings that she did for a florage chosen from old herbals by Irene Goss. And it was actually published in 1931. And this, as I say, is one of 20 botanical portraits that she did. But it gives you a sense, I think, of her careful observation. And you see it's set against an abstract background. And the next work of hers is in a different medium, which is, it's a carving that she did in 1932. It's from the Tate, and it was originally carved from a chalk pebble, which she found on Hastings Beach. And it says something about her reflection on children and motherhood. And it gives a meeting, if you like, of the ancient and contemporary fusing of sort of modernism with simplified elegance of ancient sculptures. And some of these, I should say as well, they do look much better when you see them, when they're in the gallery and when it's lit as well. There's another wood engraving I'd like to share with you, and the title here is Undercurrent. And I think that gives you perhaps a sense that something is going on here. And you can see at the top there are two swimmers. There's a male on the left and female on the right. And then underneath it, there's a third swimmer. But even more perhaps threatening is there's a predatory pike at the bottom, swimming in the depths there. You can see it. And she made this at the time of the ending of a relationship. And it was inspired by a poem by John Donne called The Broken Heart. So it gives you perhaps a feeling of maybe what was going on in her life at the time. And she'd been divorced 5 years earlier from Blair Hugh Stanton in 1933. This is another of her sculptures that I wanted to share with you next. And again, I should say in the exhibition, it's not dusty, nor is there that sort of mark on the front. But this is a friend of hers, Kathleen Raine. And she was a poet and a near neighbour of her. And this was how Hermes saw her. As she would walk by where Raine lived, she would see her working, writing in her studio. And she's captured that in this sculpture. And she actually made over 40 portrait sculptures in her career. In the 60s, and this work is from 67, but in 1963, she actually did her last wood engraving, and it was of Stonehenge. But here we have it 4 years later in a colour lino cut. And what she wanted to do was to explore the use of colour and work on a much larger scale. And she found that lino cuts gave her the freedom to do so. And you can see how she's, if you're familiar with Stonehenge, and you can see how she's captured the weathered and lined surfaces of the stones there. So that's something, again, I hope to have a snapshot of Gertrude Hermes. Another artist that we included was Evelyn Dunbar. And actually the first exhibition that I curated back at St Barb was in 2006, when the biography of Evelyn Dunbar that I'd written had come out. So it was great to have Evelyn Dunbar's work back in Lymington. And this is during the war, when 1941, when she was on holiday. It was a chance to actually get a break, and she was in the Lake District walking. You can see there from her sort of hiking gear there that very much sort of enjoyed the outdoors. So Dunbar was the only salaried woman war artist, but this was done before, this work here, Winter Garden, was done before she was appointed to record women's activities on the home front, which I'll show you shortly. This is Dunbar's garden, the family garden in Strood near Rochester, and actually I visited this when I was working on the biography. And in the back right-hand corner, you can see the family home there, the Cedars, and the so-called tower there, which was her studio, and which she shared with her mother, who was also an artist, but an amateur artist. And the garden, they employed 2 gardeners, because you can see how extensive it is. It isn't there anymore. That's all been built over now, but you can see it's well tended. They employed 2 gardeners, but other members of the family would help in it. And it was a work she started in 1929, the time when she began at the Royal College of Art. She had studied locally in Kent before, but didn't warm to the courses there, finding them too craft intensive, but she welcomed the move to the RCA. And this was, you can see, it wasn't completed till around 1937. And it shows the low tones of the sort of soft winter light. And you get a feeling that this is very much a garden of promise. And the next slide, this is 1937. So she'd been working for this Gardener's Diary for Country Life. She'd been commissioned by Noel Carrington, the publisher, to do it. The first one had actually been done by Edward Gordon, but Dunbar felt very comfortable doing this because she had grown plants. She produced a book with Charles Marney, with whom she was her tutor at the Royal College of Art, and who she was later romantically linked with. So she knows the plants that she's illustrating and that she's writing about. But this was actually a week at a view diary designed for gardeners to make notes in. But again, it was well received, rather like the other book that she did. Now, I mentioned right at the beginning about Dunbar that she was the first salaried woman war artist. And sorry, not the first, she was the only women's salaried war artist. And she was appointed in 1940. She produced some 40 paintings that were accepted by the War Artists Advisory Committee. But her work had gained acclaim some years before with the murals that she did at Brockley School in Lewisham in the middle 30s. And these are still there. You can see them at Prendergast School for Girls. And this work is actually done in Sparsholt in Winchester, where the land girls, some of them were actually trained, but it's sort of typical of her style. And I was able to interview the woman in the foreground, Josie Loosemore, the dairymaid, who was asked by Dunbar to model for other pictures as well. But she felt that Dunbar was very good at capturing the attitude of the land girls. So this next one is not of land girls, but we're still on the home front. This is in 1940 again, and this is probably closer to home and back probably in the Strood local village hall. It's a WI meeting, and it's been convened to show the members about canning, and the equipment there came from the States. Not only did they supply tractors, but they also lent or sent canning equipment, because the Ministry of Food had charged the WI with looking after the rural side of its wartime fruit preserving program. There'd been a glut in 1940, it was a hot, dry summer, and the fruit needed to be used. But you get a sense of Dunbar and the sort of quirky way she drew people. But also, if you look, the detail is still there, even though some of it is sort of simplified. But if you look on the left-hand side on the notice board there, you've got what looks like probably a Fougas poster where it says careless talk costs lives. So there's lots of little interesting detail. And I was fortunate when I was doing the research to work closely with her husband, Roger Foley, who was an agricultural economist who she'd met at Sparsholt. And when he came to the opening of the show in 2006, he said of her paintings, and he was in his 90s then, that with her work, you need to look at it closely, and it benefits that returning to it because there often is so much detail in it. And this is a prime example of one of her detailed composite paintings. It's a large painting, and she actually liked to paint on a large scale and with this sort of checkerboard motif. And this is St Thomas's Hospital in their evacuation quarters, which was moved out of London to Pyford in Surrey, where it was hopefully away from there would be lesser risks of bombing. But you can see all the little scenes there. It was a largely orthopedic ward, and you can see that top right hand corner, there's one example there, but there were civilians there as well. This took her rather longer to do than some of the paintings of the Land Girls activities, because she was less familiar with this material. But although it was slow and she was late submitting it, it was well received by the committee, who actually, they increased her fee from 35 to 70 guineas. So quite a substantial increase. So our next artist in the show is Ethel Colquhoun, and I was fortunate to visit Cherbourg, the exhibition at Ben Urey a couple of weeks ago, and to see the work by Ethel Colquhoun there. So her career was very much shaped by surrealism and the occult, and she established herself in the surrealist movement, even though she, despite the prejudice of some of her male colleagues. And this is a work before she joined really that sort of group, if you like. And this is a self-portrait. It's a very powerful work. This is done in 1929 when she was at the Slade. She was highly thought of by her tutors, and this shows her set against a backdrop of water rushing over rocks. And it's an interesting position that she adopts, that sort of sitting with her leg raised there and her hands. I think it really says something about her and how she feels about herself, her body. The next work perhaps gives you something of that, the flavour of her interest in perhaps surrealism, but also her connection to nature, which she was very interested in. And this was something she'd been interested in since childhood. And some of her earliest drawings were of floral subjects. And in fact, these flower studies, rather like this one here, or this nasturtiums, were a key part of her first solo show in 1936. And by way of background, it's perhaps relevant that she had seen Dali's paintings in Paris some 2 years earlier, and was impressed with his sort of hyper-realistic technique. But nonetheless, her flower paintings, there's an attention to detail and an accuracy there. But what I think you can also begin to see is that she's drawn to not only exotic forms, but also those that might resemble human genitalia. Now, this painting here is from Southampton City Art Gallery, and not so far away from Lymington. It's called, this one, Rivière Tides, and it was part of the series, the Mediterranee series of paintings that she showed in a joint exhibition with fellow surrealist Roland Penrose in 1939. And the title is from a poem related to the end of an affair and can be translated as Tepid River. And it's an interesting painting in that it's really quite eerie when you look at the church there, and the 4 doors, they're closed, there's no people there. And you can see that the entrances are sealed. And then from each of there's these 4 coloured rivulets are flowing from them. And Richard Shillitoe, who is something of an expert on Ethel Colquhoun and who wrote her biography as well, and has done much really valuable research on her. I think he suggests that the colours relate to her interest in alchemy, and that the red is male, and on the left, on the right, and you can see the blue is female, and there is some sort of transfiguration going on in the church. So this is another of Colquhoun's works. This is Linked Islands, and the linked islands that we're talking about in this painting are the St. Agnes, and she was interested in the story of Santa Warna, the patron saint of St. Agnes in the Scilly Isles, and was absolutely fascinated by it. And if you know of St. Agnes, it's formed of 2 islands which are linked by a sandbar, but they're separated at high tide. And here you can see what she's doing is exploring the connection between the two of them, the 2 islands, and that separation and the gendering, if you like, of the islands. And on the left of these 2 islands, you can see the steps going up there to Santa Warna's well, and those are representative of the female. And on the right hand side you have the Old Man of Goo, and you can see the standing stone there, which represents the male. And I think that's fairly sort of evident there. So her work is certainly interesting and undoubtedly challenging. And Steve Marshall wrote some really good pieces about her work. And I should say that we divided up the 8 artists. Actually, we wrote about 4 of them each. So the next slide is, or the next section, if you like, of Wilhelmina Barnes Graham. And again, you'll see a work later on that I'll show of hers that's very much like the one in Sheer Verve at the Ben Uri. So this is Wilhelmina Barnes Graham down in her studio in Porthmore, in St. Ives in 1947. And she was one of the finest modernist British abstract artists of her generation. And her career, interestingly, it straddled 2 countries. It straddled Scotland, where she was born in St. Andrews, and also St. Ives. And in both places, she actually later kept a studio. But rather like Ethel Colquhoun, she too was inspired by the natural world and the Celtic atmosphere. And her work evolved over 7 decades. So she had a long career, and very much moving from figuration to abstract, more abstract work, but always interesting colour and form and composition. And I think I hope in the next few slides, you'll see how that work was evolving. So this is a very early work done in 1940. She had come down to St Ives. She had won a postgraduate scholarship. She was at Edinburgh College of Art, and her principal, Hubert Wellington, suggested that she go down to St Ives, where her interest in abstraction would be in accord with other modernist artists who had already safely settled there. So she came down by train from Scotland, arriving in early 1940. And her friend Margaret Mellis and fellow students was very much sort of a conduit, if you like, in terms of introducing her to other artists who were already living there: Barbara Hepworth, Ben Nicholson, the Gabos, and others, of course. This early work shows, you get a feeling actually of the gloomy wartime mood, with people not knowing what was, when, how long the war would go on for. But it's a certainly very atmospheric work. There's a, can see that high horizon there, and it's very simplified, and it's, the greys are associated with Alfred Wallace, who had a studio nearby and whom she met, but they're also very akin to the greys of St Andrews. And having been there recently, when the weather has been quite dreek, when it's sort of wet and damp and cold and miserable, those greys are so similar to those of St Ives. The next painting, if you've been fortunate to go to the gallery, you will have seen the very similar one there of 3 rock formations. This is Glacier Vortex, and you can see how it's beginning to mark a new stage in her work, and here this new stage of abstraction. And she was fascinated by the strength and size of glaciers and their shapes and the reflected colours of them. And she very cleverly conveys the sense of scale with the interlocking shapes, and there's certainly echoes and awareness of Barbara Hepworth's oval sculpture. And indeed, she did own one of Hepworth's small sculptures, if I remember correctly. And this painting was completed after she'd been on a holiday, a climbing holiday in Switzerland in the Grinveld Glacier. And this, like the 3 rock forms in the exhibition in Cherbourg, they both were shown in the solo exhibition that she had in 1952, when glaciers featured strongly. So this is moving on 3 decades, the next work, and taking you now up to St Andrews, to where she would divide her time between St Andrews and St Ives. And you can see in the background the St Ives and the ruins of the cathedral, and actually beneath that and close to that is where Wilhelmina Barnes-Graham is actually buried. And I discovered some of this during lockdown, but this is the old harbour here. And in 1960, she inherited a small estate, the Balmungo estate near St Andrews, just several miles down the coast. And that was where she kept a studio, and one in St Ives from 1963, and she would divide her time between the two depending on the light and the time of year. And it was in 63 she was divorced, and for her this was it was a difficult time for her and impacted on her work. But this it's distinctive of this particular series of work, this repetitive, fine, abstracted line to represent the waves. And it was produced in parallel to her main painting. And it was very much for her way of trying to search, discover, abstracting the subject's essence. That's what she was interested in, but she was very much captured by nature in motion. Though this one, it's really, I think, it's very different. But again, you can see this, her interest in abstract and shapes and forms and color. And this was something she actually started, this series, Jeff and Scruffy series, she started in the 1950s. And the title was about associations made while she was working out her design over the weekend in Newquay, when her then husband, David Lewis, was lecturing on painting. And another lecturer was talking about architecture. And the husband of that lecturer was sat in front of Barnes Graham, and he was marking, he was a teacher, and on his lap was the dog Scruffy, hence the title of this, the Jeff and Scruffy series. But the main shape at the bottom there, the brown shape, came from her wartime drawings of men painting the boys on the sea, but this has become much more simplified. And above it, the half moon is Porthmore, the shape of Porthmore Beach. And the last one of Barnes Graham is when what she said she was letting rip. This is in 1999, some 5 years before she died. But in that last decade of her life, there was an outpouring of new work. And this was part of her Scorpio series. And she worked with freedom now, and she you can see here how she's employing these upright brushstrokes, different sizes, different thicknesses, and they dance across the canvas. And she was awarded a CBE in 2001 in recognition of her contribution to British art. Now, another artist who made a distinctive contribution was Prunella Clough, and here she is in 1964. And she turned her back on a privileged background to depict a world of industrial labour and urban edgelands. And as we'll see, her work does become more abstract. And she later won the Jerwood Prize for painting. So this is some of her early work here, 1946, where she was interested in the activities of fishermen. And you can see they're attending to the trawl nets, but you get a sense of her preference here for the sort of murky light and the limited range of colours that she used. And the next slide is a sketch, but I think you can see how her style is evolving. There's a harder edge here. There's that sort of cubist influence, flattening of perspective there. And it's nonetheless an important work for showing us how her thinking is developing. And this is moving on to 1953, where her interest has moved from Suffolk fishermen to factories and workers and lorries. And she saw the lorry as being part of the mechanical landscape. But her work then is becoming more abstract, as is the work that is in the exhibition at Ben Nuri, the bypass work. So this is by the canal. So now she was happy to drive long distances to find her subject. So now she'd moved to exploring warehouses and industrial sites beside the Thames, and this led her to canal networks. And you can see how she's interested in the arrangement of forms on the canvas and the texture and the colour. But her later paintings, this is 1995, they have become increasingly abstract, and she was very reluctant to explain her work. And one critic described her as doggedly unhelpful when it came to interpretation. So the viewer is very much left to contemplate the image, but I think we probably get a clue from the title plinth there, but in many ways it perhaps poses more questions than it answers. Barbara Jones's work next is perhaps much more straightforward. She saw herself very much as a jobbing artist. She was prolific across a number of disciplines, and she worked, as you'll see, with great wit and imagination, whether it was in her books or illustrations. She studied at Croydon, at the School of Art, and later at the RCA. And this tells us something about her interest, this shell grotto that she did in 1940. She had a lifelong interest in follies and grottos, and this actually appeared in her book of the same name, which was published in the 1950s, or the title being Follies and Grottos. This grotto was actually demolished in 1948, which she said was an act of official vandalism. Again, says something about her and her sentiments and what mattered to her. But in this painting, she draws attention to the painted ceiling, and you can see there the stalactites, which were, some of them were 4 foot long. But it was something, she was drawn to the peculiar and the picturesque, and this would no doubt have captured her attention here. This is the well, it's one of the gates leading to the large estate owned by the Drax family since Elizabethan times in Dorset. And it was likely this watercolour was related to the Recording Britain scheme, for which she did produce a number of works, but this one didn't actually appear in the final scheme. Post-war, she was still busy working. This was a lithograph for the School Prints series, which Brenda Rawnsley set up, bringing on board major artists to produce work that could go into schools, particularly sort of primary schools after the war, to help teachers and to enliven sort of classrooms, given the sort of austerity that followed war. But it's full of ambiguity when you see the title Fairground, but what's going on? You've got in the foreground just 2 children and perhaps their mother or there with them, and the chap on the coconut shy trying to encourage them to do something, but they're the only ones there. So there's something of a sort of feeling of apprehension, but also of excitement. But you can see how that would have prompted discussion for children in schools. This topiary boat on the right that she painted appeared in the guidebook she did for the Isle of on the Isle of Wight, and she wrote and illustrated it. And this was 46-foot green ship. It was the Queen Mary, which someone had been lovingly shaping to scale since 1937, and this was just outside Ventnor. And the cover was designed by her ex-husband Clifford Barry, and they remained on good terms. She had a great interest in folk art and also collected it, like Enid Marks, and this was the poster for the exhibition at the Whitechapel Gallery in 1951 as part of the Festival of Britain, which she was involved in organising, and she made an extensive contribution to the Festival of Britain. And the title came from a poem by Thomas Moore, and she explained that it expressed the vigour and the sparkle of popular art. Now, this next slide is of Monica Poole, and she had an affinity for wood engraving as a teenager, and she spent her whole career working as within the medium of wood engraving, and only later did she get recognition for that. So this is one of her early works, and this hints at her distinctive style, and it has some of the hallmarks of her earlier works. And it is an actual scene, and you can see how she likes to use strong areas of black in that sort of shady corner, and how it's framed by those overhanging trees, and it's full of interesting shapes. The next one, and I've just got, I think, 3 more slides just to show you. This is designed with pericarps done in 1967. And it was during the 60s that she became interested in rock and plant forms, and these formed an important element of her work. And again, you can see in this detailed work how she took great interest in small details, and then is able to combine them to make the composition and to give it a coherence, because it's a complex design, but it works with the abstract patterning behind. And you can see her focus on the seed heads there of oats and wheats and poppies and teasels and other elements there. So the next slide is, after the death of her husband in 1969, she needed to generate additional income. She'd been teaching silkscreen printing and lino cut. And so she made some lino cuts and was able to sell these. And she spent hours combing the beaches of Kent, looking for shells and pebbles. And you can see this interest in unusual natural forms that she had, and how she uses this sort of simpler graphic imagery here. And so the final slide that I want to share with you is one called Root, and it's perhaps one of her most striking images. And it's actually based on a real object, but she relocated it to get the effect that she wanted. And she, over the course of her career, she spent decades exploring the woods and chalk downland and coastline of her native Kent. And she found in that an inspiration for a lifetime's work. And what she said was that she believed that her work should speak for itself. And I think, and I hope you would perhaps agree that it does. So I hope that I've given you a flavour for this, the exhibition, and for these artists. And as I say, it is something of a whistle-stop tour, but I hope it's whet your appetite to want to know more. So I'll now hand you back to Sarah.
Hello, thank you. That was fabulous talk, Jill, and I really enjoyed being reminded of all those works. We're not seeing your photograph at the moment.
I noticed that. So I'm not quite sure.
Is your video switched on?
I can try now. Am I here? Yes, I'm here. Thanks. I'm sorry, because I think I was frozen throughout and people didn't see me. So
I think we just saw you
frozen,
surrounded by your books there.
Okay.
But well, it's lovely to have you actually with us live.
Right, thank you. Right, apologies, everybody.
I know we already have one question. Fran Lloyd asks in the chat, can you tell us more about why you selected these 8 artists?
Yeah, I think both Steve Marshall, the co-curator and who works at St Barb, we both have a strong interest in women artists. We've shown work before, but this was an opportunity to bring 8 British artists, and it's 20th century British art, I think, that we're particularly interested in. And so it was a question of sort of discussing together who we were interested in and also what work was available. And some of it had to be pragmatic in the sense of what we could get, what the budget would extend to, but we were fortunate to, you know, include these 8 artists. There was also, I mean, we had hoped to include Gluck, Hannah Gluckstein, Gluck's work, and also Sybil Andrews, but unfortunately we weren't able to do so. So, and I think too we had good connections with some of the private collectors who we knew had the work, and that was lucky. So some of these artists we had shown before in Lymington, but it was also an opportunity, like Wilhelmina Barnes-Graham, to bring Gertrude Hermes and others who actually hadn't been to Lymington before. So I hope that answers the question.
I know that we were, so I should say I visited with Una Richmond, who's been our fantastic advisor, academic advisor for Sheer Verve, and we were very struck by the fact our 2 exhibitions had these 3 women in common, Wilhelmina Barnes-Graham, Prunella Clough, and Ethel Colquhoun, but also I think 6 of your 8 were also members of the Women's International Art Club, and perhaps Una would be asking us a question about that. Meanwhile, there is another question from Tina Matania, who asks, who is your favourite and why?
Now that's a very good question. I think it's difficult for me. Well, I think the trouble is I get attached to all of them. It's really hard. And I think we did select, well, not only work that we liked. I mean, you can't just have things you like. I mean, it's important sometimes to step outside a sort of comfort zone and things. So, who is my favourite? I suppose I know Evelyn Dunbar best, as I've mentioned, having written her biography. So I was delighted to have some of that work, particularly the work of the Women's Land Army, because
that work.
My mother was in the Women's Land Army, and in fact my whole sort of writing about art and women's art particularly sprung from my mother's experience in the women's art in the Women's Land Army, and the importance of telling women's stories, because if we don't tell those stories, then those stories often get lost. So that interest in the Women's Land Army led me to Evelyn Dunbar, because I saw her work and I thought, this is so important. It would be good to know more about it. So I think I would have to say Evelyn Dunbar, but there is a but. It's difficult. I think Wilhelmina Barnes-Graham, I've become very attached to her work, and particularly the way she spans 2 countries. And I was really fortunate to spend time during the first lockdown in St Andrews, and to be able to retrace her steps, to find out where she was born, to actually walk as close as I could to Balmungo, where she had her studio and things. So that was good.
Fantastic. I think your picture's actually frozen again, but not to worry. I know there is something very special about footstepping artists, as I think the biographer Richard Holmes likes to refer to it.
Yes, yes, he does.
Here from Una, and she remarks on not only 6 of the 6 artists show with the Women's International Art Club, but artists in the exhibition all seem to have many links to each other, whether through art school or physical location. And she wonders if you could say more about that.
I mean, again, it's another good question. I think that's something we probably, I think we could have done more on. We didn't, in many ways, we've left some of that to speak for some of it itself as you go round the exhibition and looking at it. But we do pick up more in the book where they were at the same art schools and things. But I do think that's something really we could do more on in in the future and things. So if there'd been more time, because we could have analysed the clubs they belong to and all those crossovers and those networks. So I think what linked them is their sort of the vision that they had, their own singular, that independence, that commitment to pursue that their careers.
And it is remarkable, they were all able to have those long careers. I mean, some are better known than others, as with our exhibition. Obviously, you know, Clough and Barnes Graham, for example, are particularly well known. I'm sure a lot of people will recognise Enid Marks, as you say, for those marvellous London Underground patterns that she did. And there was that beautiful, presumably African influence in the brown pattern you showed, which became the
no, she was particularly charged with that when she was doing this in the 40s, that when bricklayers got on, and if they were leaving dirty marks, these things shouldn't be seen on the seat. So it was that sort of thing that she was working to. But she welcomed that brief, and she actually went up to where they were making the factories to check where they were making the fabric, to make sure that they followed what she wanted.
Yes, it's remarkable how, you know, much research and connections they all had to their source material, and you know, that really came out from your talk and from the exhibition. As Una says, of course, lots more to explore. Barry Hedger asks whether you have a list of unknown women artists whose work you wish to explore.
Yes, I probably do. I'm sort of working on that, because the next exhibition I'm going to do is on Purbeck artists on Purbeck in Dorset. And there's a few names that are beginning to emerge, and I'm always, when I'm doing the exhibitions, aware of the need to try to you know, make sure that there is work that's diverse and things. So I don't know who's on my list. I'm not sure. It's difficult. I'll work on that. You'll have to come back to me, and
indeed, you'll have to come back to us and introduce us to a whole lot of new artists.
I will indeed. That'd be a pleasure.
I seem to think that Barbara Hepworth worked with Purbeck Marble at one point, very early on, I think.
Well, yes, she may well have done. Certainly Mary Spencer Watson is one of the artists who I'll be writing about, who produced a lot of Purbeck sculptures. Well, Rena Gardner is another one. That's another artist who is interesting, did lots of interesting work. So if we had more time, I could go through some. But
of course. Well, that will be, as we say, a date for another occasion.
Good.
So I think as we come to the end of the questions there's some nice thanks from our guests who've enjoyed the talk. I've certainly enjoyed hosting it, and I hope you will come back to us. So just to remind everyone, we do have one final talk in the Sheer Verve online event series, and that's with Professor Elizabeth Otto, speaking about Bauhaus women, and that's back to our usual slot of Wednesdays, Wednesday 13th of December. So it only remains for me to thank Jill. Lots of thanks coming here.
Thank you.
Through so all sorts of names here: Heather, Veronica, Mary Stowe, Tina Matania, Una, Fran, Alexa, Alexandra, Lazar. So they're all thanking you for the talk as well. So we wish you a very good evening, and look forward to seeing you for the next one, Jill.
Thank you very much, and thanks everybody for coming. And I'm sorry I'm frozen, but I can assure you I'm very much alive here. But thank you for for being there and staying with it. So thank you very much. So
you. Good night.